It's my privilege to welcome Manu Pillai. As you all already know, and I was telling in the group how excited I am about this particular session. Um, is well renowned, but I think it started with this book, right, Manu? It started
Yeah,
with
that was fun.
it
Nine
started with
years
the
ago.
Ivory Throne, for which Manu won the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar, and then went on after that to achieve a lot many more interesting things in life. So he has a very interesting Wikipedia profile, and I'm
Okay.
actually gonna do your introduction. I don't know if you've seen it recently, but I'm
Not
actually
not
going
a
to do your
while actually.
introduction from that because I think it's a little interestingly, it's probably more updated than what you have from your publisher. So Manu was born in, I'm going to butcher this name, Movellikara in Kerala in
Mahabelika.
19 Movellikara, yeah, in Kerala in 1990. Grew up in Pune, got his bachelor's degrees in economics from Ferguson, and then a master's from King's College London. In terms of, he's worked with Shashi Tharoor, with Lord Karan Bilimoria, and he's also worked as a researcher on the BBC Radio 4 series Incarnations with Sunil Khilnani, which is the story of India through 50 great lives. Uh, since 2017, you've been a full-time historian. Um, he's known for his debut nonfiction work, The Ivory Throne, which I just showed you. Uh, as in 20, as of 2019, the story was expected to be adapted into a web series by Arca Media Works. Not sure if that happened. Then there was Rebel Sultans. There was the Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin. There was false allies, India's Maharaja in the age of India's Maharajahs in the age of Ravi Varma. And what's most exciting is that he has a new book which is out next month, which is called Gods, Guns, and Missionaries: The Making of the Modern Hindu Identity. So, very accomplished gentleman, obviously, and he's a historical non-fiction writer. So, welcome, Manu, and thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be here.
We've been going back and forth for a while now, but Manu has promised that one day he will teach at the retreat, um, possibly in the second half of this year, of next year, not this year. So we'll see how that goes. But that was the Wikipedia, literally the Wikipedia introduction. But we'd like to know a little bit more about what pulled you into writing. What are your influences? Because this is kind of very uh, sterile. So we want to get to know a little bit about the real you. If you want to start there.
I think, I don't know if I was always into writing as such. I think I was certainly one of the more so-called creative types in the sense that, I liked playing around with things. My favorite childhood activity was there was a game my father brought me, which was just putting things together. It had these screwdrivers and all of that. You would put things together, make all kinds of things with it. I had several collections of Lego pieces, which I used to build things with. I used to tell myself stories. At one point, my sister was always very baffled that when I was denied a certain game, I think it was Age of Empires, I basically on Paintbrush on those old Microsoft computers invented my own Age of Empires using
Oh
just
wow!
Paintbrush, creating a map and sort of, territories and armies and things like that. It was all happening in my head. All that happened on the screen was that the colors kept changing and the borders kept changing, but the whole game was in my head. So I think I was always sort of inclined towards those things rather than mathematics and science and that kind of thing. So I was definitely a creative type. And at some point, I think that got channeled into both reading and writing, and the two sort of feed off each other. You can't
Yeah.
necessarily, I don't think you can be a very good writer if you don't read
Yep.
a lot, and if you don't read diverse things, not just one type of thing, because then also your writing can get a bit stilted and hardened in a certain way. Whereas if you read different kinds of things, that really does open up your mind. So yes, that's where it all began. And then by my teens, I was doing, small kinds of writing. I often, laugh even now about this completely plagiarized so-called novel that I wrote when I was 13 or something. I'd read some book about witches and wizards, and Harry Potter was also in, so I thought I would do my own book. And it's sold readers of my father and my sister, and they were sufficiently encouraging. And then I don't know where that manuscript is. It was rubbish anyway, but clearly at the age of 13, I thought that I could write a book. Then, of
Oh
course, for a
wow!
while, it sort of vanished. I did some, usual college journalism, that kind of thing. But after that, it was at 19 that work on the Ivory Throne began, and that's where the real sort of writing and that whole journey takes off, as far as the practical stuff is concerned. Otherwise, it's just a long history of fiddling around with things in my teenage years.
So it seems like your family wasn't pushing you to do a BTech, which is
No,
going to be unusual. So you were lucky
never,
that way, huh?
not even once. I think
Oh,
I was
okay.
really lucky in that, because there are writers I know, even students of history, like people who are now writing books on history, who originally began as engineers because that's what they were pushed into by family. And
That's
then they had to
yeah.
wait a number of years before switching to what they actually wanted to do. In my case, I was left free to do what I wanted. And I think that was the partly because my father was also slightly of that creative mentality. And my mother also was from a family that respected and valued those things. So I think that
Nice.
helped very much. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Otherwise, we'd still be having this conversation, but maybe like 4 years out, because
Yeah.
BTech would have taken 4 years, and then everything would have come back from where it started.
I'm also big for commitment. If I start one thing, then I stick to it. So if I'd gone into BTech, for all you know, I'd be running a company or doing something in the engineering field with great commitment at the moment, and you would never have, heard of me, and I would have been doing my own thing.
Chalo, I'm glad that you didn't.
Yeah, I am as well. I am as well.
Yeah, yeah. Vandita also had some questions. The folks, the community, you might know Vandita is a co-founder of the Himalayan Retreat. You're on mute, Vandita.
Yeah. Yeah. So Manu, I read actually I read Rebel Sultans first, and then I read the Ivory Throne, and and since this is really a community of people who are into writing, it's a first draft club. Everybody's doing their own writing, and I don't have a background in history, but I like to read nonfiction. That's my preferred genre, and I really enjoyed reading both these books, right? So my question was more about, of course, there's a lot of research, I'm sure, that's gone into your books, all the books. I mean, they're history books, you can't just create. I mean, they're stories, but you can't just create them, right? So my question was that, what really was the process like for you to do the research? Did you, I mean, are there documents that you got into? Was it, and like, for example, especially the Ivory Throne, I mean, there's so much detail there. You have quoted, I think, the granddaughter of Setu Lakshmibai, and even just the intimate details of their household and conversations and, of course, relationships and all of that stuff. It reads like a complete story, like a novel, but it is history, right? So I was very curious about what was the research like, and also that this book has a lot of beautiful photographs. I don't know if you guys if you've read it, and I was also wondering how how does one on a very practical level, how does one even go about getting access to photographs, permissions, things like that. So just a little bit of the nitty-gritties.
So, both the books that you mentioned are very different types of books. And if you look at the writing, also the writing and the pace, the style is slightly different. Rebel
Yeah.
Sultans is brisk. It covers a vaster period of time. There's a certain amount of irreverence and humor that I try to throw into that book. And it's a meant to be a sort of fast-paced read. Ivory Throne is a 705-page book, I think, and it was a colossal work. Even at the manuscript level, in those days, it was my first book, so I didn't know what the average book manuscript was like. Today, publishers will tell you 60,000 to 75,000 words for fiction and 100,000 words to 120,000 words for non-fiction. That's the sort of ideal number that they're looking for. This book was 245,000 words, The Ivory Throne. So they had to use the smallest font possible, cram in the notes at an even smaller font, make it paperback, etc., just to be able to publish the book in a commercially profitable way. So there's that practical side to also consider. Research, you're right. It's several layers and it's several things. For me, the first thing was to read what was already out there on the subject, which wasn't very much. There were a few official reports, a few official publications from the 1940s in Travancore in Kerala. There was a book of her correspondence that one of her granddaughters had published privately. So it wasn't available in the market. I had to write to them and get a copy from her directly. So that's how that had to be obtained. So that gave me a basic outline of who this person was and what her life was like. But then you have to do a lot more. On the one hand, you have to go into the real depth of the archives and try and unearth documents, papers, intelligence reports, government files. What was what were the inner workings of her life in the palace? The palace intrigue, those kind of things, the kind of masala and the drama. And a lot of this is not masala, as you said, that I've created. It's actually in the records, because the British used to keep records of these things, and you actually have archives that give you this kind of information. The other side of things is, what did she accomplish with her power? So that's the official reports, the files, that kind of thing. The newspaper journals, what were her critics saying? What were her supporters saying? You look at newspaper records of the time to understand what the public thought of this person and what their view was. The nationalist struggle is also happening. So what did Gandhi think of her? What did other nationalist leaders think of her? She had random visitors. Edda Mussolini, Mussolini's daughter, came and met her. Are there photographs? What are the details that are available? And one interesting detail I could find was, when Mussolini's daughter came to the palace, she was taken aback to find that the Maharani used to walk around the palace barefoot. Now, for us, it's very normal to walk around barefoot, but you can sense that for a European, even inside the house, when you're formally receiving somebody else, you wouldn't have bare feet. Right? So small details like that come out of the vastness of the archive and the different kinds of sources that you're looking at. But the other thing was also, you mentioned that, her granddaughters, I've interviewed them. Because what happens is, by the time she's about 60, she leaves the scene and she goes and lives the next 30 years of her life in retirement. And then there's very little documentary evidence after that. Very little. The paper trail becomes very slender and narrow. So then how do you make sense of this person's life? So you go out to meet people who knew her children. I met one of her daughters, several of her grandchildren, nephews, people who had worked with her, descendants of people who had worked with her, people like that. You talk to them, collect stories that they had heard, anecdotes that they have. Sometimes they don't fall into place chronologically at the right year. They might remember something broadly from the 60s, but they may not remember which year exactly it was in the 60s. So there are issues like that with interviews, but at the same time, interviews, especially of people who only died recently, it becomes an important way to understand the texture of the person's life, and also to understand something beyond what the archive shows. All said and done, if you asked me and you asked my friends to represent my life in writing, we would self-present in a certain way. But only if you went and had a heart-to-heart conversation with some of my friends would you actually understand what I was like. What kind of humor did I like? What kind of movies did I watch? Did I have a negative set of traits and characteristics? Those things come out of interviews. So you have to really put all those things together. And on the photographs, yeah, that was an uphill challenge, because anywhere I could find albums and pictures, I was scanning them all. I don't know, I must have scanned about 1,000 pictures. Only about 2 or 3 dozen would have gone into the book. Less than that, to be honest. I think 20 or so would have gone into the book. But the rest, I needed that many to be able to sort of shortlist a final selection and say that this can go into the book, and I think this will do well in the book. So it's a very mixed up kind of process to put this kind of thing together.
Yeah, and I imagine it would have really taken you a lot of time, because this is a lot of work,
Yes.
So yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, it was a very, very long project. And I think I often also say that it was good that I did it in my early 20s. I didn't wait for a more convenient time. I began as a student. I continued to work on it when I was working, and I had other jobs and pretty stressful jobs, but I still continue to work on it. And I think the line that I often use is that the 19-year-old who went in is not the 25-year-old who emerged at the other end. In some ways, I wrote the book, but the book also sort of remade who I was as a person. And I think that's also very important in being a writer, in that you're also constantly evolving, your mind is constantly evolving. And now that this book was published in 2015, it's 9 years now. And when I look back, there are lots of things that I would have done differently. There are lots of things I would have perhaps changed in the language. When you're doing your first book and you're in your early 20s, you still want to show off that you know language, right? So there's some of that that's in the book. A lot of people like it, but now that I think of it, I would have perhaps gone for crisper language, been a little more sort of restrained in certain things in the way I wrote. But that's all hindsight. We also evolve as writers. If at the age of 35, I still thought that my style of my early 20s was the style I'm going to follow for the rest of my life, then I think there would be a problem, because that means you're sort of stagnating and you're not able to evolve your own thinking and your own mind.
Great. Thanks for that. So that was actually something that I was also wondering about, is that your writing spans different regions, it's different times in history. Your latest book is quite different from a lot of the other stuff that you've written. So how is that? Is that just an evolutionary process? Is that something that you consciously choose? How does that work?
I think it's there is a degree of conscious choice in it, because after I did Ivory Throne with its 705 pages, I was determined that the next book I would do would be of a very different style, simply to challenge myself and see if I could do something like that. Because 6 years on one project, that's so long, where each chapter is about 20,000 words. You get very comfortable with having that kind of space. But I was very aware that I couldn't, in the long term, go around publishing 700-page books, because even this one, I was lucky that publishers picked it up, and I was lucky that people read it and it became a commercial success. Because most books of that size do not tend to work in the Indian market, especially. So I wanted to make sure that I would be able to challenge myself and be able to write in different styles. Even when I did my third book, which is a collection of essays, very short essays, four pages each, the Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin, most of them began as newspaper columns I was doing for Mint. And there again, when they invited me to do the column, the attraction for me was that I, who am used to having thousands of words to put forth an argument or to tell a story, will I be able to condense it between 900 and 1,000 or 1,100 words? Can I pull that off? History is also very nuanced, right? History has a lot of details and a lot of layers, but sometimes just the format doesn't always allow it. Yet, how do you make it work? Yet, how do you do it in a way that history is not flattened and made simplistic, but at the same time, it is simplified. So it's simplified, but it's not simplistic. That for me, that short format of 1,000 words, that was the real challenge then. That was why the challenge was an inviting challenge. And then my fourth book and this new one, in many ways, they've been inflected by the work I was simultaneously doing on my PhD, and have a slightly more academic kind of tone, especially the new one. I've still tried to make it lively and entertaining, but the theme is serious. The theme is religion. The theme is identity. So in those things, I can't, especially in our country, I can't be too irreverent, because someone will sue me, or worse, they'll throw stones at me. But at the same time, you also need to keep in mind that the reader has to have an incentive to keep turning the pages. I can't merely, put out my argument to the extent that it pleases me. I have to do it in a style that people also enjoy, and they're also invested in the argument, and they have an incentive to keep reading the book. And the length is shorter. Although if you go on Amazon now, to tell you the book is 600 and something pages, it's actually just over 600 pages. 350 pages is the main text. Another 250 pages is just the notes, because I've got voluminous notes to my books, and the latest one also has a huge chunk of notes. So almost every sentence has a footnote attached to it, where I've given my sources, given more contextual information, and so on. So that's how I sort of meet that balance. Not everything can go into the main text, because then you're overburdening your reader with too much, and it becomes clunky. Then there's nothing interesting in reading a book like this. So what I do is make the main narrative, it has to have everything, but at the same time, a lot of the details can go into the footnotes. So
Right.
for the scholarly inclined, they can find it in the footnotes if they wish. But for the lay reader, it's enjoyable, interesting, they learn something, but it's also not overwhelming.
Right. Yeah. In fact, it was very interesting that you mentioned Nuance, because I was reading up on this book, and I think your latest book is actually all about nuance, because I think it's really about, like you said, the flattened, this assumption of who is a Hindu and what it stands for and where it came from. You've kind of unflattened it, and you've given all the layers out. And I'm going to read a small passage from that. The book is not out yet. It's going to be out on the 25th of November, but you can see it and you can pre-order it on Amazon. I'm just
I
going
would
to read
actually
the.
promote the website called Padega India, because they give a 40% discount, and they're an Indian company. So instead of Jeff Bezos, let's promote an Indian
How do you
company.
spell that? Padhega.
Padhega India. Padhega. Padhega.
All right, that's awesome. India.com.
PadhegaIndia.com. Yeah. And it's a
That's
40%
awesome.
discount. I'm actually very happy with it, because some of you writers should also know that publishing is becoming increasingly expensive for some
Yeah.
very strange reasons. Paper prices have gone up. The Ukraine war and issues with China have led to higher costs in acquiring paper. GST laws in India have further added prices for publishers. So books have become, in general, very expensive. This one is priced at $9.99. I really tried to get my publishers to make it cheaper, at least $7.99, but they simply couldn't make it work. But Padhega India, with the 40% discount, you're getting it at $5.99, which is what paperbacks of smaller books sell for now. But you're getting that price on Padhega India for a $9.99 book, 400 rupee discount. That's why I'm very happy that they're doing it that way.
Okay, that's awesome. In fact, I was just thinking that thank you so much for sharing that. I didn't know about this website, and I'm always trying to move away from Amazon. but they
Yeah.
just have such a lock on things. So I think
Bodyguard
I'm
is very
definitely
good
gonna.
and they even ship internationally. I didn't know
No,
this myself till my
okay,
book was announced and their links started appearing. And I asked my publishers, wait, is this legitimate? And they said, yeah, this is an actual venture and it is legitimate. And there you go.
very nice, awesome, awesome, great. I was actually going to read a very small passage from the book, so that people can learn a little more about it. I'm not starting with the opening. I'm doing the third paragraph. It says, in Gods, Guns, and Missionaries, Manu Pillai takes us through these remarkable dynamics with an arresting cast of characters: Maharajahs, poets, gun-wielding revolutionaries, politicians, polemicists, philosophers, and clergymen. This book is ambitious in its scope and provocative in its position. Lucid and exhaustive, it is at once a political history, a review of Hindu culture, and a study of the social forces that prepared the ground for Hindu nationalism. Turning away from simplistic ideas on religious evolution and European imperialism, the past as it appears here is more complicated and infinitely richer than popular narratives allow. So yeah, I think that's no, I think that the third paragraph actually should have been the first one. But anyway,
I, I'm talking the book that will get me cancelled, to be honest, because the topic is such a polarizing topic in India that, it's not going to please anyone. The left is not going to be pleased with it. The right is not going to be pleased with it. And my standing joke is that if after this book I get cancelled and my writing career comes to an end, I'll go back to my ancestral village in Kerala and become a full-time farmer there because that's all that will be left if I get cancelled after this book.
we already got like 10 questions, 12 questions in the group, but I do want to ask one question. So, well, I have multiple, but have you ever been tempted to write historical fiction? I mean, clearly you wrote a novel when you were 13, so that's somewhere in the back. Is that going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that my idea was originally fiction till the story of the
Mhm.
Ivory Throne came and sort of took over my life. But I always thought before that I was interested in fiction. I did some sort of it. For example, in school, we had to put up at one point, I think in class 9 or 10, we had to put up these weekly skits. And I was the only person in the class who was actually interested in it and actually wrote these skits week after week because I enjoyed that process. And there is a story at the back of my head. I'm still making notes every now and then and sort of creating a frame for it, but I haven't started work on it. I don't know when I will, but yes, there is a plan to do a work of fiction.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you a few questions now rapidly. Just one line answers. You have to answer from the top of your head, and
Bad.
then we'll open it up to the audience questions. Okay. So the first question: you have a strong social media following. Did the following come from the book, or did the book come from the following?
No, the following came from the book. I had,
Okay.
as I remember, in 2018, I had just 1,000 followers, and that's when my second book came out, and it was through the books that the following sort of built up, not the other way around. Nowadays, publishers go the other way around, which is that they
Okay.
often get
Yeah.
influencers to publish books. But on the
Yeah.
other hand, in my time, it was still the other way around. You had to do something in order to gain social media influence.
Okay. On your Instagram feed, I've seen that you're probably the fittest intellectual out there. So how many pull-ups can you do?
Depends, actually. I haven't done some in a while, but usually several sets of 10 to 12,
Several sets of 10. Oh boy. Okay. All right.
before I try.
If you had not been a history writer, what would you be?
Plan was to be an architect, but
Ah,
then somebody told me that you need to know physics for it, and I ran from the plan. And I don't know, so
okay.
architecture would not have worked out, I think.
Okay. Who is your other favorite history writer? I'm somebody
There
that
are
you look up to and aspire to.
There are quite a few, to be honest. But
Top two,
I
three.
know a gentleman called Abraham Erali. He's very underrated. He passed away some years ago. And long ago, like over 20 years ago, he was writing very accessible books of Indian history. Everything from the Harappan age all the way down to the Mughals. There's an entire set of books that you can buy, I think 5 or 6 volumes by Abraham Erali. And unfortunately, I think India was still not ready at that time for that kind of narrative historical writing, and therefore he remains underrated. But I've always enjoyed his books and found them very entertaining, but at the same time very erudite and knowledgeable.
All right, great. My last question in the rapid fire question. Do you promise to come to the Himalayan writing retreat in 2025?
I can't promise, but I will try.
All right, okay. So I'm going to open it up to the chat now. And I'm going to ask the first question is from Soha. She's saying, as a celebrated author, what does a bad day look like for you and how do you overcome it?
So I think with practice, I've realized that there are going to be bad days. So there are days when very little writing happens, and frankly, there's no mood to write also. It's not so much of a block. It's just that sometimes you're worn down by it. You do anything, any job that you do day in and day out, there are days when you have bad days and you just want to take time off. And that sort of thing tends to happen. And I let that happen. I don't try to resist it. If it's a bad day and I just want to loll around being lazy, then I don't hesitate to loll around being lazy, simply because I have a lot of like discipline. I know that the next morning, if I get up and come and sit at my desk, I will be able to resume work. It's not like the lazing around becomes a habit very quickly for me. Sometimes, I may laze around for an entire week, but I know that come Monday, I will go back to my usual routine and be able to pick up where I dropped off earlier. So I allow that to happen because I think it's a way for your mind also to tell you that it needs a bit of a switch off and it needs to sort of, do something else.
All right, great. Shweta has 3 questions. The first one I'm going to skip. The second one's interesting. Shweta, there's lots of gyan on the internet about how to form a disciplined writing routine. But her second question is interesting. She's saying, I'm torn between pursuing a PhD in creative writing or public policy. Given you have experience in both historical research and writing, what do you advise for someone like me?
I would frankly, I don't know if this is the right answer, politically right answer to give, but I would say public policy simply because if you already have an appetite for writing, I don't think you necessarily need a course unless you're going to go and teach or something. If you're going to go and become a lecturer or a professor or a teacher or an academic, then maybe a PhD in creative writing makes sense for you. But I think if you want to be a writer, then you need to gain exposure to the world. And that means studying something else, being, if you're like a frog in a well, in a small little well, you're there and you're only focused on that. I think that creates a certain kind of drawing room writing, which is that, you're so cocooned in your world. All your writing is based on what you're reading rather than what you're seeing. Whereas if you study something that's different, I think your eyes open up in a different way. For me, having worked with a politician in India, with a politician in London, having run, an office with different people, actually haven't managed something like that. Managing things, running a real life situation, those things I have in great ways affected in a positive way, I would say, my writing. Because if I had not done that, if I'd purely been a writer from the age of 20 without any exposure to the world, I don't think my writing would have evolved in the way that it did. So I think I would encourage you to do something in some other field, and while keeping your writing also alive, because your brain gets activated in very different ways if you're exposed to different things.
Great. Which book of yours would be your favorite? That's an unfair question, but or if you had to recommend that somebody start with one book of yours into reading you, which one do you think that would be? Which one maybe is the most accessible?
So the most accessible is my third book, the book of essays. I even call it my airport reads book, because often what would happen is that I would meet kids at festivals and they would, 19, 20-year-old college kids. And they would say things like, we really enjoyed your session. We'd love to read your books, but we're a bit intimidated by history because we never liked it in school. So that's why I put this book together. Short, 5-page essays where you can dip in, dip out wherever you want, so that you're not overwhelmed by it. You can read something interesting. It'll whet your appetite, but it won't saddle you with too much that you can't handle. And then if you're done with it, then you go to Rebel, Sultans, and then you go to my other books. But if you ask me which one is my favorite personally, it's always going to be the first book, because the first book is what set me off on this journey. And the first book in many ways was like a personal meditation as well. So that I
and
think.
By the third book, you mean the Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin? Hello?
Yes, that one.
Okay, yeah. So the name of the book is The Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin. Okay. All right, great. What books and archives would you recommend for learning about ancient South Indian history? This is from Ponnu Elizabeth.
Oof, that's a tough one to answer. There are like general books that you can read to begin with. Rajmohan Gandhi wrote a history of South India. Noboru Karashima has written a book that's also very good. Then there are, of course, granular studies, Nilakanta Shastri's books, older books of the early 20th century. There's that kind of material. But when you say archives, it depends very much on the period that you're studying and the kind of material that you're looking at. For example, when you're talking about something 1,000 years ago, your archive is very different compared to what you're, say the 18th century. And if you're talking about the Vijayanagara period in South India, you're going to have to learn Telugu and look at a lot of Telugu sources. But if you're looking at the Chola period, you're going to look at old Tamil sources. So the archive is a very different space for each of these periods. So there isn't one set archive for any of these things. You really have to narrow it down to which period interests you, and based on that, you'll know where to look for your material.
All right, great. The next question is interesting. This is from Sumanya. She's saying, hi, Manu, in the book, The Courtesan, the Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin, where there's a collection of extremely interesting anecdotes from history, are there stories you had to leave out? What was the criteria for a story to make the final cut?
Yeah, there were several stories I left out, but I don't think there was any such, there was no serious like thought behind it. I just thought, okay, this story is more interesting than story Y. Therefore, story X got space and story Y was rejected. That's all. And then there was a limit as to how many stories to include. So I don't want to put too many. So I think we've got just over 60 essays in that book. There's a long essay at the end, but the others are all short essays, from here and there on different themes and topics. I just wanted it to be a collection of different things, broadly divided into before the Raj and then during the Raj. So colonial and then pre-colonial. But other than that, I just wanted to tell a bunch of interesting stories just to remind people that history is actually a very diverse, fascinating, rich, layered kind of place. And it isn't one linear narrative. There's lots of things happening, and there are lots of ways in which one can approach it.
All right, great. Thank you. The next question again is from Ponu. I'm going to jump through some of the questions because I want to make sure that everybody gets at least one question in. Which writers do you admire who write popular history? So Manya, we've already answered that. Suman has a question. Hi Manu. I'm sure since your books are now widely read, you probably get pitched many less known aspects of history to be written about. And I'm sure for a country like India, there are many aspects of our history still untold. I'm curious to know what is your thumb rule for gauging if a subject is ready for writing about? Is it availability of sources, topicality of the subject, or something else?
No, so usually, I mean, the frank truth is I write about what interests me. Publishers keep pitching all kinds of things. Like, you have no idea how many, publishers get in touch saying, oh, it'll be so easy for you to write a book on XYZ because, it's already part of your research. Why don't you do a book on this topic or that topic? And it's true. If I wanted, I could easily do books on those topics, but that's not the point, right? You want to work on something that interests you specifically. And that's what I end up choosing. And it's not like I go in knowing exactly how much information is available or what the archives say. Sometimes the fun is in going in completely blind and open to the idea that you're now going to discover things after having chosen that this is what you're going to do. And that's part of the process and part of the fun, really. If you go in with too clear a sense of what you want to do and where you're going to find it, then it's not really an exciting project. For the excitement to come, you need to go in with some degree of confidence that the topic interests you. But finding the material is then the next challenge, and that challenge is a fun challenge.
Right. So Sai's question is the next one. Sai Kothai has asked a question which is sort of similar, where she's saying, how do you select or decide this piece of history matters to you, and why do you choose to talk about it? Because in fiction, our experiences are influenced or marred by some real events. How does one sift objectively to understand what to write about? So this question seems to be coming back up over and over again.
I think what you said about fiction is true for non-fiction also, at least in the way I work. The thing is, I'm not working in the academic space, right? Although I have a PhD and all of that, I'm not part of a university. I'm not an academic. So it's not like I've a core set of themes and I'm going to spend all my life working on those set of themes in that academic space at more and more granular detail. I'm very much a public facing sort of person. I'm writing my books very much with a general audience in mind of a broader set of people who are going to read these books. And therefore, what's happening in public does play a role in figuring out which book I want to do when. For example, my second book, The Rebel Sultans, which is on the history of the Deccan Sultanates, I knew I always wanted to do that book because there wasn't a book on the Deccan Sultanates. When you think of India's Islamic history, most people think of the Mughals and the Delhi Sultanate, and they leave it at that. And they forget that the Deccan had these fabulous sultanates, which were mostly Shia states, oriented towards Persia, not to the Mughals. The Mughals saw them as enemies. They were the pre-Maratha states. Barely anyone knows much about these states. And I grew up in Maharashtra, so I had a sense that these states existed, and I knew I wanted to do a book on them at some point. What really hastened the project in some ways and made me put pen to paper was the fact that around the time I started this book or published the book in 2018 is also when there's a lot of this whole jingoism, hyper nationalism, religious nationalism, all of that coming up in the country. And in some ways, you're also part of a certain society, right? And while you try not to get any biases into your work, at the same time, you're also part of a broader social fabric. And I was like, okay, I'm not good at giving lectures. I'm not good at tweets, and I'm not good at that whole social media fighting on Twitter kind of thing. So I was like, how can I contribute to this discourse without being preachy, without trying to sort of push something, which is my personal view? And I was like, let me just go in and highlight an interesting part of India's Islamic history. It has its good and it has its bad. It's not like these sultans were all wonderful people. Many of them did burn temples and enslave people and all of that. But the point is, I just wanted to highlight that slice of Islamic history because I thought at that time it was also in some ways relevant and it would make a contribution to the broader discourse in the country. And that's why that played a role in getting that book out. And with my third book, the book of essays, Courtesan, Mahatma, and the Italian Brahmin, same, because I sensed that among the young readers, among young people in general in this country, there was an appetite for history, and yet there was something blocking them from accessing interesting, good history in a way that they didn't feel overwhelmed. So I thought I must try and sort of plug that gap one way or the other. So it varies. So I would never deny that, things around you, can't play an influence on how you choose what to do at what point of time. And my new book also, which is on the modern Hindu identity, we're living, it's 10 years into the age of Hindutva, as it were. Naturally, these conversations are happening around me. I did this well before, actually. 2011, my master's thesis was on Hindu nationalism and Hindu culture and modern Hinduism and all of that. So I already had an interest in it, but then it took me a while to put it out there. But again, I think context makes a difference, especially for writers like me who are public facing.
Right. So there's a thank you for that. That's enlightening. There's a next question from Soha is interesting. What is more laborious, writing the book or marketing it?
Well, when you're writing the book, you think that is the toughest part of it. And there are times when you think that, I wish this bloody thing would just get over and sort of you can go on with the rest of your life instead of spending another year working on the book. But then the actual publishing process, which nobody talks about, is that, you write a book, right? Then you do your own round of edits. Then you do your own round of neatening it up and making it fit for publication. Then you send it to your agent, maybe. The agent will give you some feedback. You send it to your editor. The editor will give you some feedback. Then you have to incorporate the feedback. Sometimes you don't like the feedback. Now we also have a phenomenon for books of like the new one I've written, which is on religion and identity. Because of its very theme, it had to go for a legal read. So the lawyer has an opinion. You have to bring that on board and try and figure out, how much of that you're going to accept and how much of that you're going to reject. So you have to do all of that. Then you get a PDF. Then you find that the PDF has lots of errors. You have to correct those errors. The copywriter may make changes. You have to sometimes reverse those changes. The copy editor, sorry. Then there's a proofreading thing. Someone will come and say, can you clarify this? Can you shorten that? You have to do all of that. So that whole process happens, and that can sometimes be very mind-numbing. For example, like today, the book has gone to press, and I was looking at the PDF on the flight, and I found a punctuation error in one part of the book. And I was like, I've read this book at least 100 times now, but because you've read it 100 times, your eyes start glazing over a lot of things and you're missing things. So that's not very good either, which is why you need multiple people reading and looking at it. Even then, a small punctuation error can slip through the cracks and make it to the final print that the press is putting out. So those things happen. And then comes the marketing. And of course, I would say that I'm very lucky in the sense that because I've already created a certain amount of space, I'm able to therefore gain a certain amount of attention in the press and all of that. But for a lot of first-time writers, that's not the case. It's a very tough space out there, especially after COVID. Because printing newspapers itself has become more expensive. Less and less people are now reading physical newspapers. So the amount of space allocated in a newspaper to books has reduced. So what used to be 2 or 3 pages is now often 1 page or 1.5 pages that's allotted to books. So there's practical issues like that. So you're competing for space in a very narrow sort of territory already. There isn't much real estate in a newspaper left. And you have to then push yourself. So and then I still make the effort of writing to editors myself, getting in touch with people myself. I don't leave it to my publishers. I did that for my first book as well. I remember staying up an entire night drafting emails to every newspaper editor whose email you could find online. The Tribune, the Times of India, the Hindu, Hindustan Times, wherever, anything I found, I wrote to anybody and everybody. And very, solidly individually crafted emails for each of them. Many of them didn't reply. Some of them actually did. I still remember the Tribune, I think, which is based in Punjab. They had no reason to send a book on a figure from Kerala out for review, but they actually did, because I think the editor appreciated that I'd written to him and I'd written a certain, sort of personalized kind of email, and he did that for me. And I was very happy that the Tribune ended up reviewing my very first book, because that first book is what needs to be noticed in order for you to build that initial platform from which you're going to be able to market and sell your subsequent books. So yeah, it's always a bit of a headache. It's always a bit of a pain. One always hates it when there are other important books being released at the same time as yours, because you realize that, now there's even more competition. So there is stuff like that. But in another, viewed another way, it's also an interesting challenge and an adventure in its own right. How you push your book, how creative you can get, how you can get people to talk about it, think about it. All of this makes a difference. Today, for example, this website, Padega India on Twitter, they put up a little pie chart showing how most of the pre-orders for my book, what geographical areas they've been coming from. And it didn't surprise me that over 50% came from Karnataka and Kerala, another chunk from Maharashtra. And I think basically the point was the big cities in South India. Like, that's my core base of readership. And I found that very exciting. For me, just seeing that in a pie chart format was thrilling, because I was like, wow, this is such interesting data. I had a hunch, I knew this, but it's still, to see it in that format was interesting. So I think I enjoyed it a great deal.
In fact, you've been published by Juggernaut, and we had Chiki on the FDC, I think 18, and she said this very blatantly. She said people in the north don't read. All the reading only happens in the south and in the west. So she was just completely, matter of fact about it. And I guess this pie chart seems to be saying the same thing.
No, because as a publisher, I've noticed this about different. There are cities where you go where at a lit fest, I'm not going to name cities because people get upset, but there are places you go where at a lit fest, a huge crowd will show up, but very few of them will actually go and spend money picking up the book. There are places, on the other hand, where you go where people who already have the book forgot to get it for a signature, so they will buy a second copy and then get you to sign it, and then they'll gift that or the first copy to somebody. So you see that in different cities and different parts of the country. There is some truth to the fact that some parts of the country are more interested in, or maybe have the wherewithal to some extent to read and to invest in books, and some parts of the country don't. I don't judge, but you can certainly see it in my sales figures and the geographies in which I'm selling.
Yeah. We even see it in our participant profile, that we get a higher number of people who are interested in writing coming in from the south and from the west as compared to, the north. So that's, I think it's, maybe it has something to do with vegetarianism. Maybe vegetarian people read more.
Oh, but the south is not vegetarian.
I know. That's perpetuating a second stereotype. All right. So the next question was, how do you address people's need to use a modern moral lens in assessing history? It's an interesting question.
Again, not by preaching at them, because I think that sort of thing backfires. Nobody likes being put in a place where they're told, oh, I'm judging you and you're wrong. I think the way I prefer is the more long game, which is put out well done history, where you're not preachy, where you're not judging, and where you're acknowledging the complexities. As I mentioned, the next book, my new book that's coming out next month, I'm conscious that on social media, different types of people will cancel me for different things. Because there are certain set narratives on all sides of the political divide. And when you go against them, not everyone's going to like it and they're going to say nasty things and all of that. But I'm prepared to take the risk, because I think for the intelligent reader, they will realize that it's not coming from some place of calculation or bad faith. For me, this is what the evidence shows, and I should be able to put that across no matter what my feelings. So if in some context, the book is Gods, Guns and Missionaries, is about Hindus and their encounter with Christian missionaries primarily. In certain contexts, if the missionaries were relatively like negative figures, well, you have to acknowledge that. In other contexts, if they actually played a positive role, you have to equally acknowledge that. I don't see why one has to choose between the two when both are equally real. One should be able to bring both of those things out and say that both are equally real, and it is fine. It is okay for something to be good as well as bad at the same time. So I think this whole like moral lens pressure that we live with, we have to, I think, try to surpass that and move above that and beyond it. That's the only way to sort of take this forward. History is complex, especially the space I work in. Our own lives, think of our own interior lives, right? The image we project in front of our friends and our associates and family, and the actual inner lives that we lead. There's such a contradiction sometimes between the two. What we're actually thinking is not what we're telling our parents and our siblings and even our partners and best friends. So if our own personal lives are that complicated and difficult to put down in one box or in one simplistic kind of narrative, imagine society, imagine the present, and then imagine how complicated the past would be. So I think we have to just learn that this whole like moral business is just about making ourselves, for some people at least, it's about making themselves feel superior, or sort of dig their heels in as far as their convictions are concerned. But if you're working with history, you have to be willing to challenge everything other people believe, but also everything you believe.
Right. Brilliant. Yeah. So you're basically saying that history doesn't have an agenda, or somebody who's representing history can't come at it with an agenda.
Yeah,
You come
I
at it
mean,
with the facts.
you comment with the facts. Of course, as creatures of society, we will have our biases. We try to
Yeah.
minimize them. Some level of bias will remain because I'm also a product of society. I'm also a
Sure.
product of a certain upbringing, of a certain education, of a certain time and place. You know,
Yeah.
the same facts in the hands of a historian 100 years ago is not how the historian today will deal with the same facts, because our social perspectives have changed, how we look at the material has changed. So that kind of element will always be there. But I think we should work in good faith and try not to let our biases get in the way of saying and being able to say even some uncomfortable things, if that is what the record shows.
Right. So I'm going to make this the last question. There were a few others. I'm sorry we have to skip those, but I'm going to make this the last question because we are at the second last week and I do want to spend a little time on the tracker. Uh, but Weber has a pair of excellent questions. First is, any moments when you felt that readers understood your book differently from what you had intended it to be? And second is, did you tone down any text keeping in mind people's appetite for the truth? Weber.
So the first, no, not really. Where people have not understood what I meant and taken it badly is on social media. I think because what happens is when you're writing and you've got your footnotes and you've got the space to explain an argument in all its details, then you're relatively solid because you have the space to do that. But sometimes, say you're doing a conversation with somebody on YouTube, or you're having, or you're putting out a reel on social media, you've only got a few minutes, you've only got a certain fixed duration, and you're also speaking off the cuff, right? It's not like I come into these conversations with a set of notes in front of me. Your brain is thinking as you're speaking. So then you sometimes miss a few things, or then sometimes you put things across, perhaps not in a way that is as expanded and as layered as you would do when you were writing. And that sometimes leads to people assuming that, you know, what you say is the full, the sum total of what you've written. That's not actually the case. The writing is a lot more complex. But sometimes when you're on social media, because the format is different, you have to present it in a slightly different way. So there I found that it leads to certain, tricky sort of situations. But again, I wouldn't blame most readers for it. Sometimes there are what I call performative people who want to come and just perform their own virtue on social media. So it's mostly that crowd. But leaving some room for good faith, I would say maybe there are others who genuinely misunderstood what I'm saying. But that's only on social media. I've not really seen that in text. In terms of the other part of the question, yes, I think when my second book was translated into Marathi, there were one or two parts where we had to tone down, not because I had said anything, but the quotes that I was actually using from historical records itself, even though they were 17th century quotes, it was felt that in the Marathi language, it might upset certain people, because that's not just a core crowd of readers, right? In a local Indian regional bhasha, it can also reach a very different set of people who are not interested in history, but who are interested in making politics around history. So there I remember the translators were keen to not remove it, but to sort of make it lengthier and sort of explain and add certain adjectives to show that we were not endorsing this particular quote. It was coming out of a record. Whereas in the English one, it was obvious. One did not feel the need to actually have to put it out there that yes, this is a quote, I'm not saying it or whatever. So there's cases like that. With this new book also, after it went to the legal for the legal read and the lawyer's notes came back, most of them, my publishers, are more than happy. They left it to me entirely. To be fair to them, it's not like they insisted that I do anything to the manuscript. They said, look at the legal feedback, and then you decide how much of it you want to incorporate. And there were one or two points where I was like, yeah, I think this could potentially rake up trouble. All said and done, I want people to read my book and learn something from it. I don't want. There are some people who enjoy the publicity that comes from notoriety and controversy. I'm not one of those people. I don't want controversy for the sake of it. I want people to actually engage with the contents of the book. So I said, okay, in these one or two cases, sure, I will make sure that these quotes that could cause offense, I paraphrase them rather than quote them as they are. Because the actual quotes, even though they're again from historical documents, they could end up causing and generating unnecessary controversy. So there are some realistic challenges one faces like that today. And it's quite sad because at a level, it is a form of self-censorship. But we do live in the world that we live in. And I live in India. I don't live in some cushy university abroad where I'm free to say what I want in the way I want it. I still have to live in this country. And therefore, there are some places where one has to, for want of a better word, compromise. And you still say what you want, you say it in a way that, is a little more diplomatic.
Yeah. Well, this has been brilliant. Thank you so much. I especially like the phrase that you used for the drawing room writing. I think that was definitely a one takeaway for me, because I mean, we run a writing retreat and we see a lot of people who are trying really hard. So sometimes trying too hard, and that's what that leads to. But yes, thank you. It's been brilliant. It's been insightful, and I would recommend for everyone, please go out and pre-order your copy of Guns Gods. And now I'm also going to go check out padegaindia.in.
Yes, please do.
And
the discount is
and
not
I'm
last time.
yeah, definitely. I'm gonna buy it from there or from a bookstore. That's my usual go-to, is I'll go into a bookstore and buy a book from there. So thanks, brilliant time.
Okay,
And then we can go
thanks
forward.
again for having me. Bye.